Well, welcome to Create Good's Webinar Wednesdays. In 2020, we're sharing some of the best content from our 2019 conference on Wednesdays, leading up to our 2020 conference in April. I'm just so glad that you're here today. It's so great that you're giving yourself this gift of time to expand your skills and your knowledge for your own communications at your nonprofit. So thank you so much for being here today and just taking that time to learn and expand your skills. So with the Create Good conference, I personally think it's the best conference for nonprofit communicators. We are pretty rare. We are one of the one and only conferences that is really focused on the nonprofit communicator. We're really focused on kind of small to medium nonprofits, and it's a great opportunity for you to come and meet folks who are in the same type of job as you, that they have the same challenges and opportunities with their everyday job of trying to figure out how that you're going to manage social and email and video all at the same time. And, should you do TikTok? Who knows? It's one of those things. It's a great opportunity to talk to people who are, facing some of the same things that you do day in and day out. And this year it is on April 23rd and 24th in Durham, North Carolina. So we'd love to have you come. We do have tickets available, and they're ready and on sale at creategoodconference.com. And there you can find out all of our current speakers and the sessions and things like that. And the next couple of weeks, we're really finalizing our schedule and our final speaker list. So it'll all be very real very soon. So I'm Dawn Crawford. I'm the CEO of BCBC Ideas, which is an agency that works exclusively for nonprofits. So we host Create Good every year as our give back pro bono project. It's something that we do really completely on our borrowed time. And it's a great opportunity for us to give this amazing opportunity for the people that we love most, which is nonprofit communicators, to get together and enjoy each other and learn something new. So now I'm going to hand it over to our speaker today. Kate did a great job, and she was one of our top 5 highest rated speakers at Create Good 2019. And her session on crisis communication and how to survive it was really well received. And so I just really wanted to share that content again with you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Dawn. And thank you to everybody who joined. I know it's hard to break away in the middle of the day, so I appreciate you giving your time to me. So I'll try to make this as useful as possible. I've been in the nonprofit world, I probably have about 14 years of experience, but more than 20 in communications as a whole. And my probably most significant career to date has been about 10 years spent with the national headquarters of the American Heart Association, which is based in Dallas. So we launched a number of national campaigns, and certainly during that time had our fair share of crisis communications and reputation management challenges. So really the way this is structured is that I've selected a couple of case studies, and we'll talk through those and would love to get feedback. I'll stop after some of those and just kind of get some feedback from you all about, your thoughts on what worked and what didn't. And then I'll share some of my own best practices based on my experience, and then we'll open it up again for questions. So I hope that works for you all. So the other thing that's of interest here, I think with crisis communications and the drum you'll kind of keep hearing me beating is just planning. And I think that's a key word for sure with this. This is my Twitter handle. I don't use Twitter a lot, so actually LinkedIn is probably a better source for me. I worked with Wethos on this. I had been a consultant for them for about a year. And so Rachel Rennock is the CEO. So we had presented this together back in the spring at the conference, which, by the way, if you haven't had a chance to go, please do. I think it's one of the best conferences out there for small to mid-sized nonprofits. So the first part of this is I'm going to present a couple of case studies, and I'm going to stop, like I said, and have you weigh in on kind of your perspective. So it's kind of like the good, the bad, and the ugly, kind of how to handle a crisis situation and how not to handle it. So the first one I'm going to share is this one is the bad. So it's whistleblowing, cover-ups, and defensiveness. And you may have heard of this. This happened a few years ago. It involved the organization Oxfam, which I think it's a relief, like a global relief services, and their CEO at the time, Mark Goldring. So here's a scenario. There was a story that the Times in London broke about just some gross misuse of funds by some of their top leadership who were in Haiti to help with relief efforts after the earthquakes that happened. I believe that was in 2011. And they were using Oxfam funds to pay for prostitutes. And some of the prostitutes were underage. So it was this big expose. So Oxfam did launch an investigation, and they ended up firing one of the executives, and then subsequently a few more resigned. And then the CEO, he made a statement just saying that Oxfam, there had been no cover-up, and that it wasn't like Oxfam had murdered babies, which I don't know if that makes you cringe as much as it does me, but like every time I see that or hear it, I have the same visceral reaction. So as a result of their crisis management, about 7,000 regular supporters were lost. They had a number of corporate partnerships that disintegrated, that they went away after that. So that was the result of their reaction. So my question to you all is, what could they potentially have done differently? So I'm going to go over to the chat box. And let me know in the chat box, how could this have been handled better so that there wasn't that fallout from, I mean, obviously there's going to be some fallout, but, was there a better way to manage this? Yes, heartfelt apology. I think, Courtney, agree. Killing babies should never be part of your speaking point. Yeah, I like what, is it DeQuandre? I love what you said, new policies to ensure it doesn't happen again. Yeah, corrective action, Blake, full investigation, and a promise to do better. Yes, all that is so great. Y'all should be leading this. This is all really great. So bad. Okay, so the next one we're going to do is... And so I'd be interested too, because this did bring out some discussion in the live session, the in-person session at the conference. But this is one that's more recent, and this was with Starbucks. So if you'll recall, I think it was about a year or two ago, there was a Starbucks that was in Philadelphia, and there were two African-American men who were there, and they were customers and used the restroom, and the police were called on them. It ended up being a huge, national issue. And as a result, Starbucks closed down all of their stores for one day and did a bias training for all their employees. I do remember that very shortly, I don't know if it was 24 hours, but it was pretty close. The CEO had a video that they released on social media that basically was like, we are sorry, this shouldn't happen, and this is what we're doing. So the interesting discussion that came out of this when this was presented before was, just questioning whether that was really enough, and really does one day equal a cultural shift in a company. So I do think that's very valid, and think that it could have gone a little bit further. But I think for the purpose of our discussion today, I'd like to get your thoughts on, was this sufficient? Their reaction, any thoughts that you have on that. So please feel free to share in the comments, or if you want to chat about it. I think everybody's on, so you can share your verbal thoughts. So anybody?
I actually do feel like it worked.
Agree.
Dawn. Yeah. I
agree with
enough,
JP.
right?
I remember.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I like what JP said. I was really impressed with the timeliness of the response. Yeah, and I don't know that there's been any additional incidences. Are y'all aware of anything else that's happened? Yep, they turned it into a positive. Yep, Courtney, that's great. Great feedback. That they can't, it's hard when you are a nonprofit or a large organization or company, you can't control your employees, their bias, but you could educate them. Yeah, America, exactly. That there was an education component. Great. So, like I said at the beginning, I think so much that is a determinant of whether or not a crisis, how well a crisis is managed, is really being able to develop those proactive strategies ahead of time so that when something does happen, you at least have a baseline to go with. So I'm going to share an example of what happened with the American Heart Association. And one thing to think about, that while this is not a crisis in the fact that it was something that happened immediately and we had to react to it, it was something that we foresaw could definitely result in a major crisis, and how we used that to help shape the narrative and the messaging. And I think from this, there's some good things that you can pull from to apply to any crisis situation. So as I said, I worked for the Heart Association for about 10 years. And during that time, I'm going to skip over the slide. So sorry about that. I feel like there we go. Okay. Sorry, that was annoying to do this scrolling. So the Heart Association is an almost 100-year-old organization. They're almost $1 billion in annual revenue, 4,000 employees, I think, and they're global. And they're known for the research. So they develop a lot of guidelines that determine treatments for, a lot of things like cholesterol and high blood pressure and CPR. So in 2017, they were set to release their new guidelines for high blood pressure. So this had been a 2-year process. There were about 20 experts from around the world who reviewed about 1,000 different pieces of research to really determine, what the best guidelines were for treating hypertension or high blood pressure. And the challenge is that, high blood pressure, it wasn't going down, and people weren't taking that as enough of a wake-up call to take the right actions and the steps to change their lifestyle in order to improve their health. So we knew about 6 months in advance that the research was going to go in the direction of lowering the baseline at which a person was diagnosed with high blood pressure, which would mean literally overnight, 50% of Americans would now have high blood pressure. So we really, it was a huge effort on, it wasn't clearly just me or my team. It was a huge group effort really to try to figure out what the best messaging would be and to make sure that we didn't create some kind of mass hysteria with the guidelines release. So we developed 3 key messages that were pulled through in interviews with every major outlet. So I think we had 19 stories within the first 24 hours, across Reuters and AP and Washington Post. And every single one had the messaging pulled through either through one of our spokespeople or, just in the text or the rest of the story. So I think that was really important, was that we got on board with the messaging. I think for the sake of this conversation, I'm talking about preparing for a crisis. What was really interesting and I think helpful for this whole process is that we were very focused on who would be that final point of contact for approvals if we did have any blips or there was any negative press, or we needed to do a statement, like some sort of reactive statement. So just as kind of a behind the scenes look at the Heart Association, it's a massive organization. It's very multi-layered. Typically, it takes a long time to get any kind of approvals, and usually one of those is the CEO, Nancy Brown. So what they decided during this time was that the chief science officer would be the last word on approvals, which was great because, normally that process would have taken a long time. And knowing that the news cycle is short, we knew that it was really imperative for us to manage the narrative, to have that direct line of approval and to be able to move swiftly. So I'm going to stop there. Do y'all have any questions? Any questions there? I'll stop for just a second. Okay. So the next one I want to show, this is another one. The Tourette Association of America was a client of mine for about a year, and I worked with Wethos on that account. So this is interesting because it shows both sides of how an organization can kind of take advantage of a potential crisis situation, but also how the business that had kind of where the crisis bubbled up, how they really had an impact, or how they reacted to the situation. So here's what happened. There was a young man in his 20s who has Tourette syndrome, and he'd actually been a youth ambassador for the Tourette Association of America. He went and worked out at a Planet Fitness in Orlando, and he was making a lot of noise, and the Planet Fitness manager kicked him out, which is actually against the ADA. So the Tourette Association, there are accommodations for people with Tourette that are part of the ADA guidelines. So he threatened to sue, and he went to the news media locally in Orlando, and then there was Planet Fitness is a franchise, so there's one franchise owner for 3 locations in the Orlando area. And he saw this as he pulled in the Tourette Association, and he saw this as an opportunity to educate the staff on what exactly Tourette syndrome is, and also kind of what the guidelines were around ADA compliance, specifically as it related to Tourette syndrome. So they did this. The CEO of the Tourette Association flew in, and the gentleman who had Tourette syndrome, he dropped his lawsuit. I think what's really interesting that I saw, if you compare the if you can see here in the background, the headline. So it started out as man with Tourette syndrome kicked out of gym for making too much noise. And then afterward, Planet Fitness apologizes. So that really worked well for Planet Fitness. Just to be, I don't know how often that happens, that a news media will have a follow-up story, showing the positive. So I think they were really fortunate that it worked out that way. Fox News National ended up picking up the story, and then they ran, a follow-up as well. I think for the Tourette Association, it really gave them the opportunity to help educate people about Tourette in a positive way. And so they could be part of this conversation, to really, in the middle of what could be deemed a crisis, to really kind of help with understanding, because it is a very misunderstood condition, and definitely has there's been it's been the butt of a lot of jokes, and so really to have that opportunity to share their perspective was, it was a win for both sides for sure. So these are all, all the examples that I've given you, or most of them, really are more, kind of have built up to the planning piece of it. So what do you do when the stuff really hits the fan? And I think, so these are some tips that I have just based on my own experience. I think the first thing, it's really difficult when you're in that situation, especially if you have to be reporting up to board members or to executive leadership, and then you've also got to deal with the media too. Your instinct is just to make, you kind of want to just make it go away, and that may mean, trying to do a knee-jerk reaction. I think it's really important to just like take a minute before diving in and just like take a deep breath, get as many as the facts together as possible. And I would even say to do that before, like gather all the facts before you start talking with your internal teams too. I think it's best to really create a memo. It doesn't have to be anything like super fancy, but even just an email memo that really just has like, this is what has happened. Here are, here's what we're going to do. Here are all the people, here's what's being said on social media. This is what we know so far. And here's our plan of how we're going to manage this. I think it's also really important to identify the key stakeholders within your organization from the beginning. And that's something that you can probably do, and probably should do before a crisis actually hits. So, if you're the person who's the middle person, and you're the one who is gathering all the information, and you're developing messaging, and you're kind of the go-between, getting the approvals and all of that, it's going to be really hard for you to do that role and manage and monitor social media and monitor Google alerts and also manage your executives. So I think, because you can't just be, you've got work to do. You can't be constantly being pinged by people saying, what's going on? Can we get a status update? And so I think that's really important to establish those roles and responsibilities and lay them out in that initial memo that you sent. And then I think that's also where, if you haven't already established what your approval process is going to be, then absolutely you need to set that all in stone. And this goes along with that too, is just, making sure everybody's on the same page. So I even would recommend doing an all hands meeting for all the people who need to be involved in it. So, all the people who have a function within that crisis, for you to walk through the memo, for you to be able to establish who's doing what your time frame is, what your plan is, and then throughout the day have some check-ins. So maybe it's a few hours later, and then toward the end of the day, and then for sure the next morning, just to kind of check in and monitor. But I think having that voice-to-voice or face-to-face contact is really important, because it's so easy to get overwhelmed with all the emails and CCs and all of that. I think for speed, sometimes it's just easier to pick up the phone and just have a conversation. I think it's also important to think about who are all of your audiences and how are you going to be sharing the news. So think about what's the hierarchy of who needs to know what at what point. Is it internal people? Is it your board, and then your internal people, and then customers potentially, or donors, or anybody on your kind of donor services, or we said customer service here, but anybody who's outwardly facing. What are you going to put on your website? So all of those things to think about, what's the timing of when those things should happen. And also, those are things that you can, I think would be helpful to determine before, in a crisis communications plan before something actually happens. And then the other piece is, okay, who's going to be the point person? So kind of as I talked about before, if you're kind of serving as that point person and pulling all pieces together, who's going to be your spokesperson? Who's going to be managing the C-suite? So those are all really important things to make sure that that you have in place. And then I think one of the final things is, a plan is great, and it's great. I think it's super important to have that structure in place. I know organizations that have, because Dawn and I were talking earlier, most of the time in a nonprofit, I mean, knock on wood, you're not going to have a crisis every single year. I mean, hopefully you only have one, every 5 years. I think a lot more of what you're doing is reputation management versus crisis, an actual crisis. But I think just like anything, just like a fire drill, just like, anything else that to help it become more muscle memory, to have some kind of practice and scenario, so it's not just sitting in a binder on your desk for when there's a crisis, but really opening it up and looking and working through that on, a semi-annual basis. People are just to make sure that everybody's aware, and, you're going to have staff changes. So it makes sense to be able to pull that out every once in a while. However, that being said, I mean, I think it's important to have a strategy and a plan, but I don't think that you should feel like like you absolutely have to follow it to the letter. Every situation is going to be different, and it's a baseline or framework for how you probably react in a crisis, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And the last piece of this is we used to do this all the time, not just for crisis situations, but also for campaigns. We would call it an after action review. Some people call it a retrospective, but really it's walking through what worked, what didn't, what could we do better, and what would we like to have, how would we like this to look differently next time. So we had just kind of made it a little bit easier with loved, learned, lacked, and longed form. So that's all I have. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Like I said, I'm not on Twitter very often. The better way to get in touch with me is through email or via LinkedIn. My LinkedIn address is Kate M. Lino. So feel free to reach out to me there. With that, I'd love to open it up to you all and see what questions you have. Okay, great question from Blake. How'd you convince full board leadership to accept final say from the chief science officer? That came from the CEO. So I think, it was really having our communications team explain, like, look, this has got to move quickly. There had also been, there had been a situation, like a full-blown crisis, like a year or two before with the cholesterol guidelines where we weren't really ready. So, and there was a delay in us being able to respond. So I think, unfortunately, seeing how that played out made it a lot easier for the CEO and the board to say, okay, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a certain level of trust too that came with that. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question. So yes, you want to plan before the crisis, and this kind of annual. I mean, what's the best place to start? Is it something that you think the communications team should do internally? Do you think you need to get external kind of idea storm or like brainstorm together? Like, what's the best way to start a crisis plan if you don't have one?
That's a great question, Dawn. I don't think it has to be complicated. I think, I worked for Pier 1 Imports for a little while early in my PR career, and they had like this huge binder, and they had thought of like every single scenario. I don't think you have to do that. I think really, maybe it's like a one pager that's really like, okay, in a crisis situation, like here's who's doing what, and these are the roles and responsibilities. And, we're going to agree that we're going to have one person approving things, or whatever it is that's comfortable within your organization. But yeah, I think, to try to come up with like every single scenario that happens and try to create messaging ahead of time, I just think things like you just don't know what's going to happen. And so I think trying to I don't think you need to overthink it, but I do think it's important to have those structures in place.
Yeah. And I think it's that look across the table of responsibilities is really key in that plan. And yeah, and an annual reconfirmation of those responsibilities. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And even just to go through one particular scenario, I think if the communications team can lead that, again, I don't think you need to hire external people to do that. I think you all are professional communicators. I mean, you can. I just don't think that it's. Again, it doesn't have to be that complicated.
Yeah, and it just helps. And I think in a crisis, having that in hand really helps a lot of people who are very, freaked out by the crisis, and that, and that you can augment it as you need to in the moment. It's not a procedure, right? It's a plan. And I think,
right.
Yeah, it helps people all the way around the table of having something that this is what we thought we wanted to do. Let's check to make sure it's the right thing. So yeah, that's great. Okay, I have a question.
This is a great question. What if the organization as well as the community served by the organization were both impacted by the crisis, such as the town level by a storm and the organization's office is also gone? Do you go into details such as how to keep going and address your community when you are also affected? Yes, I totally think so. So we had this when the hurricane hit a few years ago in Houston. It closed our offices were closed there. I mean, granted, we had the advantage. This is when I was at Heart, had the advantage of that wasn't our only place. But we did create like a website, like we created a landing page of here's where to go in, if you have, specific needs, particularly like if you need medicine, here's where you can go. So trying to be a resource. Yeah, absolutely. I think you should. So if it's possible, even just to put something on your website or to manage through like using your social media, I think that's really important. Emily, did that answer your question? That was from Emily Roush. Okay, great. If handling a crisis using internal. Emily, I think everybody's on has a microphone, so if you want to share your question verbally, that'll work too.
Hey, sorry. Sorry, I'm doing this on my iPad, and it's really hard to type. So if you're handling a crisis using internal staff, what are some things that we should be looking out for, or when should we be evaluating when to get external help?
So that's a great question. That's a great question. I was thinking about that earlier too. I mean, I think if it's something that's national in scope, which honestly, like now with the internet, I mean, anything could potentially bubble up to become, a national issue. But I do think if it's something, it's going to be a judgment call. But I think if it's something that really is impacting, has the capacity to really impact you at a national level, and maybe you're a small nonprofit, I think if there's like legal ramifications, for sure, I think for sure, you want to be consulting with attorneys, or if it's, say if it's embezzlement of funds, or, I mean, I think those kinds of things you definitely want to not just be managing internally. If it's something like managing a storm hits and you're trying to manage that, or, in the case of the Heart Association with it's the guidelines and trying to, say it's a negative news story and trying to do that, or some negative publicity on social media. I think a lot of that can be managed internally. But I do think it's just monitoring it too. I mean, if it starts to snowball, then definitely, I would look for external help, but I think a lot of it can be managed internally. Did that help, Emily?
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much.
let's see. As you asked in the Starbucks scenario, do you have any advice about gauging when a response is enough to a crisis? I think it goes, Heather, thank you for that. I think it really goes back to, like, you need to be monitoring to see, is your response, like, what's like doing some social listening. So what are people saying on social media? Are there any additional stories that are being written? So I think, a lot of times I was asked to create talking points, like reactive talking points to things that we thought were going to be a crisis, and then they just went away. So, I think it's a good balance, right? Like, if you don't want to stir something up if there's not anything there. But I think it's, you react and then monitor and just see, do things seem to be settling down? And I mean, I think the great thing about social media is that it's a pretty good litmus test for kind of how, like, what's going on and how you're being perceived and how things are going in a specific situation. You bet. Oh, sure. On the evaluation piece, Blake. So it's loved. Let me go back up. Loved, learned, lacked, and longed for. So loved is, what did you do well? Learned is, what did you learn from the experience, or what could you have done better? Lacked is what was lacking, or what didn't go well. And then longed for, what you could have done, what you could do better in the future. You bet.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today and rewinding this presentation. It was really great. And thank you for sharing your knowledge again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And again, for any of you who have further questions that weren't answered, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or via email, and I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Great. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Hope to see you on our next webinar or at Create Good in April. Thanks. Have a great day.